in the high, lonely mountains of Kentucky, where the old wilderness road wound its dangerous way toward the western frontier, there once stood an inn that travelers spoke of in hushed, almost reverent tones. They called it the Millbrook Inn, and they said it offered something no other place could, a kind of warmth that went far beyond clean beds or hot meals. 4 sisters kept this mountain refuge. Men would arrive as strangers, but leave feeling as though they had stumbled upon something rare, something worth risking the treacherous road again. The Cunningham sisters' reputation reached far beyond these ridges. Merchants delayed their journeys just to linger another night. Cattlemen braved hostile passes to avoid missing the chance to stand at that welcoming door. Those who had stayed told of a comfort lonely travelers rarely knew attention so personal, so intimate, that more than one hardened man was seen to weep when it came time to ride away. But in the winter of 1851, the tone of the stories began to change. Travelers arrived in nearby settlements with unsettling tales. The road to Millbrook Inn, they whispered, was now littered with abandoned wagons and riderless horses. At first, local authorities dismissed it as frontier exaggeration, until the disappearances formed a pattern too grim to ignore. Dozens of men had vanished without a trace, and the last place any of them had been seen was on that winding mountain path leading to the Cunningham sisters' door. What the authorities were about to uncover would reveal that the warmth of Millbrook Inn came at a cost far darker than anyone could imagine. The story truly begins 2 decades earlier in the year 1831, when Jeremiah Cunningham succumbed to consumption. He left behind an 800-acre mountain estate and 4 daughters aged 16 to 26. Their land, wedged between Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and the Kentucky frontier, was rich with livestock, grain fields, and most important of all, a strategically placed inn for travelers heading west. Margaret, the eldest, at 26, had a mind as sharp as any merchant's ledger and a cold, calculating nature that would later prove deadly. Catherine, at 24, had their mother's unearthly beauty and an uncanny gift for making any man feel as though he was the very center of her world. Sarah, 22, carried her mother's deep knowledge of mountain herbs, a knowledge whose uses were not always so innocent. And Elizabeth, the youngest, only 16, had a guileless charm that could disarm even the most guarded stranger. Their grandfather had built the Cunningham estate in 1798, when the wilderness road was little more than a raw trail, cut through dangerous country. By the time Jeremiah's daughters came of age, it had become one of the most respected stopping places between the eastern valleys and Kentucky's bluegrass country. Its 2-story log house, built on a foundation of stone, standing high on a ridge that looked down over the valley like a watchful sentinel. The inn itself was no grand hotel, but it didn't need to be. 6 comfortable guest rooms lined the upper floor. Downstairs, a wide common room wrapped around 2 massive stone hearths, their fires often burning late into the night. In the kitchen, the scent of bread-roasted game and mountain herbs had a way of drawing even the most road-weary traveler back to life. But the Cunningham name was not built on walls or furniture. It was built on trust. Over 3 decades, Jeremiah had cultivated a reputation that reached far beyond these mountains. Men spoke of it in towns hundreds of miles away. The warmth of the welcome, the sharp bite of their home-brewed whiskey, the comfort of a clean bed after weeks of mud dust and danger. The property's small staff was as much a part of that reputation as the sisters themselves. Ezra Hawthorne, a weathered mountain man in his 50s, had been with the inn since its earliest days. He knew these ridges like a man knows the lines on his own hands, and his loyalty to the Cunningham family was beyond question. There were also the Zimmer brothers, Klaus and Heinrich, German immigrants, who had arrived 3 years earlier, chasing the promise of steady work. They lived in a cabin at the far eastern edge of the property, where they tended the livestock and fields with a methodical precision that only deepened the estate's prosperity. By the autumn of 1831, locals would later say, the Cunningham sisters entered their golden years. What had begun as a necessity, 4 young women running a business alone, became something close to an art. Margaret's calculating mind kept the ledgers balanced. Catherine's beauty and gentle voice made guests linger days longer than planned. Sarah's skill in the kitchen and her quiet talent for brewing teas that soothed the body and mind earned them a reputation for unmatched comfort. And Elizabeth, still only 16, carried a bright, disarming energy that could soften even the most suspicious drifter. But beneath that picture of frontier grace, something else was taking shape. The very isolation that had once shielded the Cunningham family from the dangers of the wilderness was now giving them something far more dangerous: privacy. And privacy in the hands of 4 sharp-minded women with few scruples was a tool that could be turned to darker purposes. It was on a cold November evening in 1832 that the first shadow crossed Millbrook's warm light. Thomas Kellerman arrived just after sunset, a cattle buyer from Richmond traveling alone. In his saddlebags, he carried a heavy purse of gold coins meant for purchases in Kentucky. At 45, recently widowed with no children and no close kin, he was exactly the kind of man the Cunningham sisters would one day learn to recognize on sight. The temperature had already fallen below freezing, and a thin snow whispered down from the black mountain sky as his horse labored up the last bend toward the inn. Margaret met him at the door. She had seen the fine cut of his coat, the way the leather straps of his bags bulged, and most telling of all, the deep, aching loneliness in his eyes. A man like that was carrying more than money. He was carrying a hunger for connection. "Welcome to Millbrook Inn," she said, her voice a careful mixture of businesslike poise and soft warmth. "I'm Margaret Cunningham, and these are my sisters. We'll make sure your stay is everything you need it to be." Kellerman's expression shifted, not just relief, but something like gratitude as he stepped into the glow of the common room. The air was fragrant with Sarah's venison stew. Across the room, Catherine was arranging fresh wildflowers in a vase despite the frost outside. The sight, the scent, the fire, all of it, told him he had arrived at the right place for a man like Thomas Kellerman. Millbrook Inn was not simply a place to rest. It was exactly what his weary heart needed. Here he was, not just another traveler paying for a bed. He was treated as though he belonged, as though someone had been waiting for him. Over the next 3 days, the Cunningham sisters surrounded him with a kind of attention he had never known on the road. Sarah's meals were feasts perfectly seasoned, venison fresh bread pulled steaming from the oven, and her famous honey cakes that seemed almost too good for a place so far from the cities. Margaret engaged him in long, thoughtful conversations about business and politics, speaking with an intellect that made him feel respected. Elizabeth's bright, unguarded laughter at his stories gave him the pleasing illusion of being worldly and interesting. But it was Catherine who gave him what he truly hungered for, the fragile illusion of romance. On his second night, when the common room had gone quiet and the other guests had retired, Kellerman sat alone by the fire. His eyes were fixed on the flames, his expression that of a man staring into the hollow space left after loss. Catherine approached softly, 2 crystal tumblers in hand, the golden liquid inside catching the firelight. Sarah's spiced rum sent up a curl of fragrant steam. She settled into the chair beside him with a graceful ease. "You seem troubled, Mr. Kellerman," she said gently. "Sometimes sharing a burden can make it lighter." For the next 2 hours, Kellerman poured himself out to her. He spoke of his late wife, Mary, of the years they had spent hoping for children that never came, of returning each evening to an empty home that still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap. Catherine listened with perfect attention, leaning close, touching his hand lightly when the words seemed to weigh too much. "Loneliness is a terrible thing," she murmured as the fire sank to embers. "But it doesn't have to be permanent." What happened after that was never written in any ledger or report. But the next morning, Kellerman's expression spoke for him. He ate breakfast with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found some long-lost reason to keep moving forward. He extended his stay by 2 more days, despite having been in a hurry to reach Kentucky. He even spoke of his return trip, how he would pass through Millbrook again, how he would tell other travelers about this remarkable place. "I've never known hospitality like this," he told Margaret, pressing nearly double the usual payment into her hands. "You and your sisters have something truly special here." Margaret smiled, businesslike but warm. "We look forward to seeing you again, Mr. Kellerman. Safe travels." But Thomas Kellerman never reached Kentucky. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering near Cumberland Gap, saddle empty. There was no sign of him. On the dangerous frontier, the explanation was easy enough: bandits perhaps, or wild animals. Only the Cunningham sisters knew the truth. Heinrich Zimmer had been waiting in the woods half a mile down the road. The German immigrant worked well with tools, and he had a quiet efficiency that made him useful for certain tasks requiring discretion. Kellerman never saw the blow that killed him, a single strike from a blacksmith's hammer to the base of the skull. His body was wrapped in canvas and carried to a pre-dug grave deep in the forest. His heavy purse of gold found its way back to the kitchen table at Millbrook Inn. That night, the sisters sat together counting the coins under the warm lamplight. Margaret, ever the strategist, had already done the sums. Kellerman's gold exceeded the inn's honest earnings for an entire year. Catherine had proven that a lonely man's heart and judgment could be stirred with startling ease. Sarah had shown she could erase every trace of evidence with her knowledge of herbs and chemistry. And Elizabeth had shown that even the youngest and most innocent could keep the darkest of secrets. "He won't be missed for weeks," Margaret said, stacking the coins neatly. "No family, no close friends, traveling alone. No one here knows him. Perfect." "It was almost too easy," Catherine added softly, wearing the same expression she had used to comfort him. "He would have given us anything." What they had discovered that winter night was worth far more than gold. They had discovered how to make a man disappear. The winter of 1832 gave them time to refine their methods to build a quiet system of rules and signals. Under Margaret's guidance, they began learning how to spot the right kind of guest the moment he walked through the door. Margaret's system soon revealed its first rule. The perfect victim was a man traveling alone, with enough money to tempt him, and few ties that might cause alarm if he vanished. No wife to write letters, no business partner waiting for his arrival, no fixed schedule to trace his steps. Sarah's role expanded beyond the kitchen. Her mastery of mountain herbs turned into a deeper, more dangerous study, the silent language of poisons. Pokeweed berries, when prepared, just so could mimic the symptoms of cholera. Foxglove could still a man's heart in a way that seemed entirely natural. Water hemlock could end a life within hours, leaving almost no trace. Behind the main house, Sarah tended a hidden garden. To the casual eye, it was a patch of medicinal herbs for teas and remedies. But woven between the thyme and the mint grew her true arsenal, a private pharmacy of quiet death. Catherine honed her craft into something more precise, a chameleon of the heart. She learned to see the deepest need in a man's eyes and become its answer. With the devout, she was humble and pious. With the learned, she became a well-read conversationalist. With the grieving, she was pure comfort, a steady place for their sorrow to rest. Whatever a man longed for, she gave until he could no longer imagine leaving her. Elizabeth, still barely more than a girl, became their most unlikely shield. Her youth and wide-eyed charm made suspicion dissolve. A guest who might have held his guard high could not keep it long in the presence of someone who seemed so incapable of deceit. And in her bright chatter, she learned things. A man's route, his purse, his destination, all without ever asking a question that seemed out of place. The work of disposal was handled with the same unflinching precision. The Zimmer brothers, Klaus and Heinrich, had discovered a chain of natural caves hidden in the mountainside, accessible only through a narrow gap behind a rockfall. Under the cover of night, bodies could be carried there and walled away behind loose stone. The mountain itself, with its damp air and mineral soil, would hasten decay. Anything of value was quietly absorbed into the Cunningham household. Anything that might name the dead was destroyed or buried elsewhere. And then there was Ezra Hawthorne. His role may have been the most dangerous of all, for his reputation in these parts was ironclad. When word reached the settlements of a missing man, it was Ezra's voice that soothed suspicion. Yes, he would say gravely, he stayed with us, left in fine spirits, heading west. His weathered face, his calm manner. No one thought to question him further. By the spring of 1833, the sisters were ready for their second test. William Fraser, a tobacco merchant from North Carolina, arrived at Millbrook Inn on a cold, rainy April night. He carried nearly $500 in silver, the fruits of a season's crop sales. A bachelor of 38, known for keeping to himself, he often traveled alone to avoid sharing profit. After weeks on poor roads, the sight of the inn's lamplight must have felt like rescue. And once inside, the Cunningham machine moved into motion. Margaret drew him into conversations about markets and trade quietly, uncovering his route and timetable. Sarah's suppers, rich, savory, and comforting, made him slow to think of leaving. Elizabeth's laughter at the piano softened him, reminding him of the daughter he'd never had. And then, as always, came Catherine. On his third night, she found him alone, in the common room, a leather-bound book of poetry resting in his hands. She approached shyly, asking if he might read aloud to her. She confessed she had little education but loved the sound of beautiful words. For 2 hours, Fraser read by lamplight. At first, his voice was careful, almost uncertain. But as Catherine leaned forward, listening, as though each line were the most important she'd ever heard, he grew more sure of himself. When the last page was turned, she placed her hand softly on his arm. "You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard," she whispered. For a man who had carried his loneliness like armor for decades, William Fraser found it slipping away. "I've never met anyone like you," he told Catherine, his voice thick with a warmth he'd forgotten he could feel. "Then don't leave tomorrow," she replied gently, the lamplight turning her eyes into twin pools of sincerity. "Stay. Let me hear you read again." And so he stayed, not just another day, but a week. Each evening, Catherine wove herself deeper into his life, while Sarah, with quiet precision, began lacing his tea with the smallest measures of pokeweed extract. At first, the symptoms were almost nothing: a sour stomach, a hint of dizziness. Fraser thought little of it, blaming travel, poor weather, and the unexpected stirrings of love. On his final night, Catherine invited him to her room for a private dinner. The table was set for 2 candles flickering in the low light. Sarah had prepared his favorite meal, and a bottle of wine, infused with water hemlock, measured to the drop. Across the table, Fraser spoke freely of his dreams, his fears, and the life he thought might be beginning. What he did not know was that it was already ending. The poison worked as Sarah had promised. His death came swiftly, without a struggle, the perfect mimicry of a heart that had simply failed under the weight of joy and excitement. By morning, William Fraser lay in Catherine's bed, the picture of a man who had slipped away peacefully after a night of passion. Even a doctor, had one been summoned, would have found nothing unusual. Margaret had thought of everything. A tidy grave was dug in the inn's small cemetery, among the markers of long-dead Cunningham kin. A headstone was carved his name carefully, etched a show of respect that concealed the truth. To the locals, another burial at Millbrook was nothing worth noting. His silver, his valuables, all vanished into the sisters' hidden treasury. His horses and wagon were sold weeks later to passing traders. As for William Fraser himself, the story went that he had chosen to remain in Kentucky, starting a new life far from home. No one looked closer. By the close of 1833, the Cunningham sisters had perfected their craft. Their work was slow, deliberate, and invisible. Never more than 4 or 5 victims in a year, never enough to leave a pattern. Each death had its explanation: an illness, an accident, or the irresistible call of the western frontier. Above all, they trusted one another completely. But the story of Millbrook Inn was only beginning. Between 1834 and 1845, its name traveled far beyond the valley. Travelers spoke of it with reverence, as though it were a hidden jewel of the mountains, a place where the food rivaled the great kitchens of Richmond. The beds were softer than anything in Baltimore, and the company unforgettable. Margaret's ambitions shaped the inn into something larger. There were fine horses in the stable, now a small distillery producing rich amber whiskey, and guided hunts in the surrounding wilderness led by the ever-trusted Ezra Hawthorne. And behind it all, the sisters smiled and served their secrets, buried as deeply as the men who came to stay. The sisters' legitimate ventures prospered in those years. Their whiskey was prized by gentlemen in Richmond. Their hunting parties whispered about in Charleston drawing rooms. To the world, they were not merely innkeepers. They were accomplished businesswomen capable of turning a mountain outpost into a place of refinement. In Margaret's neat ledger, the one that still rests even now in the Virginia State Archives, you can read the parade of names. Merchants from Charleston, politicians from Richmond, land speculators from Baltimore, adventurers from as far as Boston. Many came again and again, bringing friends singing praises of the Millbrook Inn. But beneath this respectable facade, the machinery of death never slowed. It ticked on with the same cold precision as a well-made clock. The sisters had refined their art, not merely choosing their victims, but studying them, mapping every weakness before making a move. Catherine's instincts had grown uncanny. She could see a man's solitude the way a hunter sees a deer's trail in the set of its shoulders, the way his eyes avoided lingering too long. Sarah's collection of poisons had expanded to a cabinet's worth of powders and tinctures, each with its own tempo, its own signature of suffering. Elizabeth's gentle chatter could draw out a man's history without him ever realizing he had told it. Margaret, as always, orchestrated it all, every role assigned, every risk measured. Between 1834 and 1845, they would take 43 lives. That number would not be known until long after, when a railroad surveyor's records uncovered what lay beneath the earth. One of those lives belonged to Jonathan Waverley. He arrived in September of 1838, a man of careful habits and solitary work. A land surveyor from Pennsylvania, he roamed the wilderness for months at a time, his maps and instruments worth a small fortune. The job paid well, and his task was dangerous enough that should he vanish, no one would question whether nature had claimed him. He kept to himself, speaking little, and seemed to prefer it that way. Margaret saw at once what he was, an ideal target. The sisters began their work. Sarah served him suppers of venison and wild fowl, each dish tied to the rugged mountains he loved so well. Elizabeth listened wide-eyed as he spoke of charting ridgelines and river bends, making him feel his knowledge was rare and valued. Margaret drew him into quiet discussions about land investments, letting him believe she might be the key to future profit. And Catherine became his reflection. She met him not with flirtation but with a shared reverence for the wilderness. She named the plants and birds they passed, not all from the years she claimed to have spent in the hills, but from the countless hours spent learning the very species she used in her poisons. One afternoon, standing on a ridge where the valley rolled out beneath them, Waverley's reserve softened. "I've never met a woman who understood the mountains the way you do," he told her. "Most people see only wilderness, but you see the order in it." Catherine's eyes lingered on the horizon, then on him. "I've lived here all my life," she said, her voice low, the wind curling around her words. And in that moment, whatever caution Waverley carried seemed to drift away with the autumn air. "The mountains have taught me things books never could," Catherine told him softly. "Things about life, about death, and the balance between them." Jonathan Waverley should have left after 2 days. That had been the plan, a quick survey, a few notes in his journal, then on to the next stretch of uncharted ridge. But instead, 3 weeks passed. His maps were still spread across his room, though the ink on them had barely dried. the truth was simple. He could not pull himself away from Catherine. Each day, Sarah prepared meals for him, hearty dishes flavored with wild herbs and game he had seen Ezra bring in from the hunt. At first, the food carried nothing but hospitality. Then came the smallest traces of something else. A whisper of toxin so gentle it could be mistaken for fatigue. Day by day, the dosage grew until the signs were unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Sarah's choice was a new creation of her own, an extract from the destroying angel mushroom. In the mountains, men had been taken by mountain fever before. The symptoms were familiar: weakness, confusion, and the slow betrayal of the body's own liver. Even the most seasoned doctor would not have seen the difference. Within a week, Waverley could barely rise from bed. Within 2, the man who had spent his life striding through wilderness could not walk the length of the inn without leaning on the wall. By the 3rd, the illness had taken him entirely. To the town, his death was a tragedy, but a predictable one. A surveyor alone in the mountains. The hazards of such work were well known. His fine surveying instruments were sold to a merchant in Kentucky. His maps became part of Margaret's growing cache of knowledge about the region. And his body joined the others in the silent mountain caves. Yet, to the community, the Cunningham sisters remained models of virtue. They attended Sunday services in Millbrook, gave generously to local causes, taught children, nursed the sick, and organized gatherings for lonely homesteads. Their standing made them untouchable, the kind of women whose word would be believed without question. Over the years, they wove themselves into the region's economy. They bought land, lent money, and even took shares in riverboat companies on the Ohio. By 1845, they were counted among the wealthiest landowners in Western Virginia. Newspapers lauded them as proof of what women could achieve on the frontier. But every brick in their empire rested on bones. More than 40 men had fallen into their web Millbrook Inn. As it had become beautiful on the outside was a spider's trap. The first unraveling came not from a lawman or grieving family, but from within. Heinrich Zimmer, the younger of the German brothers who worked for them, had never been quite as steady as his sibling. A hunting accident in 1849 had left him in pain, and Sarah's laudanum had dulled it, but also clouded his mind. Nightmares came. The faces of the dead would not leave him. On a cold February morning in 1850, Heinrich stumbled into the kitchen, his eyes wild from a sleepless night. "I can't do it anymore," he whispered to Sarah. "I see them every night. All of them. 43 men. 43 souls." Sarah spoke softly, her words smooth as river stones. "The medicine is playing tricks on you. You're imagining things." But Heinrich shook his head. "No, I know what we've done, and I know it has to stop." They spoke for nearly an hour, his voice swinging between rage and pleading, until she coaxed him back to his cabin with the promise they would speak again later. She already knew there would be no such talk. That night, Sarah served the Zimmer brothers a special dinner with wine Heinrich favored. The foxglove in his cup was enough to still a man's heart in hours. By morning, Heinrich was gone, his death quietly attributed to a weak heart. Klaus survived barely, but suspicion had already begun to root in him. Margaret saw it clearly. The web they had spun for nearly 2 decades was trembling. One wrong move and the entire thing could come apart. The last guest to die at Millbrook Inn was Samuel Hartwell, a cotton broker from Savannah, Georgia. It was March of 1851 when he arrived traveling with over $1,000 in gold and crisp banknotes. Hartwell was a widower in his 50s, bound north to arrange contracts with Pennsylvania mills. His days at the inn unfolded as they had for so many before him. Fine meals, warm company, and Catherine's undivided attention. Within a week, the old pattern played out. Once more, sudden heart failure, followed by quiet burial in the mountains. But this time, the sisters left a loose thread. Hartwell had promised to meet a business associate in Pittsburgh on a fixed date. When he never arrived, that man began asking questions. And the questions found their way to Millbrook County. Sheriff Thomas Brennan had worn a badge for over 2 decades. He had seen blood feuds, riverboat swindles, and the aftermath of winter starvation. But he had never seen anything like what he was about to uncover. At first, the inquiry was routine, polite visits, casual questions, confirmation that Hartwell had stayed at the inn and departed in good health. Margaret and Ezra played their parts well. The guest ledger showed a neat signature, a tidy date of departure, and the notation northbound to Pittsburgh. But Brennan kept tugging. A blacksmith in the next county recalled shoeing a bay gelding matching Hartwell's mount on a date several days too late. A merchant swore he had sold supplies to a man matching Hartwell's description after the man was supposed to have left the area entirely. Small things, the sort of details that might mean nothing at all. But they lodged in Brennan's mind like grit in a wound. When he began pulling at the threads of other disappearances, travelers last seen in the shadow of the inn, the numbers began to speak. In 2 decades, more than a dozen missing persons traced their final known steps to Cunningham land. Frontier hazards could claim a man easily, but the clustering was too sharp to dismiss. Brennan kept his work quiet, asking questions away from town, avoiding any hint that the sisters were under scrutiny. His break came by chance. On one of Klaus Zimmer's rare trips to town, Brennan caught him outside the general store. The German's shoulders were bent, his voice low. My brother Hendrik, he was troubled before he died, spoke of things that kept him from sleep. Klaus looked away toward the mountains. The mountains hold many secrets, Sheriff. Not all of them should stay buried. Most men would have let it pass as the mutterings of grief. Brennan did not. He arranged a meeting far from the inn's reach. There, with no eyes upon them, Klaus began to unravel. He never named the sisters outright. Fear and old loyalty held his tongue. But the fragments came late-night activity in the woods, hurried burials, and the way Hendrik had spoken of the dead as if they stood at his bedside. It was enough. Enough for Brennan to put pen to paper and sign his name to the request for warrants. The raid came at dawn. April 15th, 1851. 8 armed deputies surrounded Millbrook Inn, their boots crunching in the frosted grass. Brennan had arranged it with care. Federal marshals in place, warrants in hand, every avenue of escape sealed. He suspected the crimes might reach beyond Virginia's borders, and if the sisters felt fear, they hid it well. Margaret opened the door herself, her voice warm with polite concern, as though welcoming an old friend. Catherine's eyes shimmered with wounded disbelief. Sarah busied herself offering coffee to the men who had come to take her away. Elizabeth stood behind them, all looking bewildered and small. But the walls of Millbrook had kept too many secrets for too long. Inside the main house, the search turned up ghosts in every drawer. Samuel Hartwell's silver pocket watch, its engraving still bright. A leather folio bearing the name of Thomas Kellerman. Bundles of letters and photographs from men whose names had long since stopped being spoken. In Sarah's garden, the truth grew in neat, poisonous rows. Belladonna, water hemlock, monkshood. And in her private chambers, books dense with chemical formulas. Meticulous notes on dosage and symptoms, each page quietly recording a death. Then came the final wound to their silence, the burial caves. Klaus Zimmer, now facing his own charges, led Brennan to the concealed entrance behind a tumble of rock. The air inside was cold and dry, and the lamplight revealed 43 skeletons laid out in their final permanent arrangement. Some bore the small round punctures of a blade pressed into the base of the skull. Others showed the drawn, warped bone of heavy metal poisoning. All of them had been guests, and none of them had ever left. The trial gripped the nation. Newspapers spilled every detail: 4 women, 2 decades, more than 40 dead. The prosecutor's case was ironclad, the pattern undeniable. Margaret denied everything, swearing the evidence had been planted by enemies. Catherine broke in the witness box, swinging wildly between sobbing confessions and furious denials. Sarah refused to speak at all. Elizabeth wept and pleaded that she had been only a child when it began a pawn of her older sisters. Their lawyer spun a story of orphaned women doing what they must to survive in a brutal land. But the jury could not be swayed. Less than 3 hours after retiring, they returned with the verdict guilty on every count. The sentence was swift. Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were to hang on October 12, 1851. Elizabeth, spared the gallows, but condemned to life without parole, was taken away in chains. On the morning of the execution, the sky was the color of old pewter. Hundreds gathered to see the end. The sisters stood together one last time as the nooses were placed. A trapdoor creaked, and the long, bloody chapter of Millbrook Inn closed forever. Margaret Cunningham met the gallows with the same frozen composure she had worn through the trial. No tears, no pleas, no final words for the dead. Beside her, Catherine and Sarah stood together, hands clasped tight as the ropes were drawn around their necks, a last flicker of sisterhood bitterly out of place against the years of quiet cruelty they had shared. Elizabeth did not hang. She was taken in chains to the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond, where she would spend 37 years behind high stone walls. Until her death in 1888, she swore she had been no killer, only a pawn in her sister's designs. No one came to visit. She left no written word of her life at Millbrook. Klaus Zimmer, whose testimony had brought the caves to light, vanished after the trial. Some said he went to Ohio. Others swore Missouri. But wherever he wandered, he carried the weight of what he had seen, and perhaps what he had done. Ezra Hawthorne, the sisters' quiet accomplice, was given 10 years. He died in prison 3 years later, still claiming he had never guessed the truth. Millbrook Inn itself was sold, but its name was already poisoned. The new owners tried to run it as a respectable business, yet no traveler would sleep there. Eventually, the buildings were torn down, replaced by the roar of a copper mine. The shaft where the dead had lain was sealed by court order, marked only with a rough-cut stone. Here lie unknown travelers, 1832-1851. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life. The case reshaped the laws of Virginia. Guest ledgers became mandatory. Deaths had to be reported. Inns were subject to inspection. They called them the Cunningham laws. Modern criminologists still study the sisters. Margaret the planner, cold and deliberate. Catherine volatile, charming, dangerous. Sarah the poisoner, quietly enthralled with control over life and death. And Elizabeth, the mystery no one can quite resolve. The most unsettling truth is how close they came to getting away with it forever. Had Heinrich Zimmer not broken under the weight of his nightmares? Had Sheriff Brennan been a man of less persistence? The Millbrook Inn might still be standing in the mountains today, its doors open, the hearth warm and death waiting quietly upstairs. The tale of the Cunningham sisters is in the end not just a story about four women, it is about the world they moved. Through a time when the road between two towns could be as far as the ocean, and a missing traveler might not be looked for until the seasons had changed. In such a world, a warm bed and a kind smile were lifelines, and for the unlucky bait, the sisters understood this better than anyone. They made the very idea of hospitality into a weapon and used it with unflinching precision. For decades afterward, the name Millbrook drifted through Western Virginia's folklore. Some swore the sisters were victims themselves, poor isolated women, driven to desperate ends. Others claimed they were witches, their victims drawn not by charm alone, but by spells whispered in the dark. The truth, as the court records tell it, is simpler and more frightening than either story. Even into the 20th century, hunters and hikers found strange tokens in the hills around the old site. A dented button, a scrap of rusted metal, the corner of a rotted shoe. Were they relics of the dead, or simply the mind's way of making a place live up to its legend? No one can say. In the 1980s, ground-penetrating radar hinted at other graves in the earth shapes in the soil, silent and unclaimed. But the law forbade the spades from striking. And so, the questions remain. Were there 43 victims, or far more? The files of the Cunningham case kept in the Virginia State Archives are still there. Brittle pages filled with Margaret's meticulous records, Sarah's poison notes, and the lists of belongings taken from those who would never travel again. They give us a rare, clear picture of how murder can hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability. And so the lesson lingers: monsters do not always bare their teeth. Sometimes they pour your tea smile and offer you rest. Even now, when the wind turns cold in the Blue Ridge and the trees seem to lean close, some wonder if the ground still keeps its secrets. Secrets no sheriff ever found. Secrets that perhaps no one ever will.